Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all. Welcome any visitors that we have. It's good to be back. That's nice. You know, uh, it's a new appreciation for a lot of the things that we have here. I came home and I went to go get some food, and I was like, wow, we have I went to Shake Shack, and I was like, we got houses just for food. I'm like, that's awesome. It's so cool. Chuck was talking this morning about how in the Bible, like a non-specific command is like go into all the world, and you can, take a plane, take a boat, take a car, whatever. But I wish that somewhere in the scriptures there was a passage that said, "Thou shalt not take United Airlines." It's the absolute worst, the worst. I might touch on that whenever I do the presentation, but I had a whole nother trip, like coming home. It was quite an adventure. So I'm still kind of recovering from that, but glad to be back with you all this evening. And if you will, turn to Deuteronomy 6. I can't remember if I said that already, but Deuteronomy 6 is where we'll be starting out this evening. This is kind of a development and a movement forward of the last lesson that I gave right before I left, which was about... That's a joke. No one. Don't expect you to know what I said 3 weeks ago. But when last time I talked, it was about eyes and ears, about having ears to hear and eyes to see, like Jesus talked about there. Whenever he says that phrase, "Let he who has ears to hear, let him hear." But what I want to talk about in this lesson is what different voices are like trying to grab our attention. It's kind of like just addressing these different problems and also these different helps that God gives us about these different voices in our lives that we can choose to listen to or we can choose not to listen to. And I want to start right here because this passage is really kind of the heart and soul, I think, of, when Jesus says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear," it was probably referencing right here in Deuteronomy 6. In verse 4, it says, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might." So that word "hear" in Hebrew, the word "hear" is the word "shema," and it means to hear or to listen. So on those worksheets, I don't have slides tonight, but notice that first one. The word for "hear" in Hebrew is the word "shema," Shema. And Shema is, I talked about this in the last lesson. It's not like just hearing words. It's not just about just hearing words. It's like whenever I gave the example of one time when I tried to touch a plug outlet. My mom said, don't touch that. And then 2 seconds later, I stare at the little video camera and I reach for the plug outlet. It's like, do you Shema? Are you Shemaing in that moment? No, I was not. Because I was not doing what I also heard my mom say. And so then this is where, in James, we hear about the one who's not just a hearer, but a doer of the word. In Hebrew, that's combined in this word Shema. And so what's so important is that we take care of who we listen to, because who we listen to is also how we live in the Bible. Whenever we listen to someone, if we're really listening to them, it also affects how we act. So how we listen is also how we act. And so now I want to just discuss, and we'll talk about a few different stories and examples of these in the Bible, but 3 different voices that can appear in our lives. The voice of the crowds, the voice of family and friends, to kind of bind those together, and then also our own voice, like our own thoughts, our own conscience. How do these affect our lives, and what is good and negative ways that they can affect our lives by listening to these different voices? So if you will, think about the story of Pharaoh now, because I want to jump into that first one, the voice of the crowds, the voice of those that surround us at large. What do I mean by that? Well, in the story of the Exodus, Moses, when he's speaking to Pharaoh, he says, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh says, "I will not let your people go." And then God sends these terrible plagues, and there's plague after plague after plague. And towards one of the final ones, I believe it's plague number 8, Pharaoh's very counselors, the people that surround him, that advise him, they're like, "What are you doing?" They're like, "Cannot you see that Egypt is ruined?" They're like, "Let the people go." And Pharaoh just doubles down. He's like, "No, I will not let the people go." So Pharaoh, he actually had these voices of the crowds around him, his advisors, that were telling him the right thing to do They were trying to influence him in the right direction, to listen to Shema, to God's voice, and yet he doubles down and doesn't listen to them. And now, closely connected to this, let's think about another king in the Bible who had some counselors. And that was the king Rehoboam. And in the story of Rehoboam, he's just become king after his father Solomon. And then the people, they come to Rehoboam, they say, hey, lighten up your father's load on us, because the people have been oppressed by Solomon and his taxes. So Rehoboam, and he goes and he asks his advisors. He asks the old advisors and he asks the young advisors. Says, what should I do? And the older advisors are like, hey, you should lighten the people's load if you want them to trust you and to be loyal to you. But then his younger friends are like, they're like, play hardball. And so like that's what Rehoboam does. He listens to the voice of his younger advisors. And then what that does is it causes the kingdom to rift. It causes chaos, it causes division. And then we have the northern and the southern kingdom. It's actually another type of exodus as Israel leaves Rehoboam. And they form the northern kingdom of Israel, and then Rehoboam rules over the southern kingdom of Judah. So both of these cases, one Pharaoh, he didn't listen to the crowds around him that were telling him the right thing to do. And then the other king, he listened to his advisors and the crowds around him that told him the wrong thing to do. And he listened to that. And just another example, like there's these kept coming to mind as I was collecting different examples of this. But think about the voice of the crowds on the last week of Jesus' life. What does it say whenever he enters into the city? Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. They are like praising him. They're saying, blessed is like the son of David. Like the blind people are proclaiming Jesus' name. The crowds are all declaring him their king. And you're like, wow, this is great. Like maybe if you were there, like you should have joined in with the crowds and proclaimed Jesus as king. But then at the very end of Jesus' life, what happens? What do the crowds say? Or at the very end of the week, what do the crowds say about Jesus? Crucify him. Like we don't want Barabbas. We want him to die. Like we want Jesus to die. Like if you were in the crowds in that moment, like which side are you on? So the crowds, and we even see throughout the book of Acts, there's many riots in the cities. And it's like one person shouts this and another person shouts that, and it says nobody knew what was going on. So what I want us to also see is this pattern as we go through each of these different voices, is that these voices are hard to discern. Sometimes they're saying something true and good. Sometimes they're not. How do we decide between that? And we'll come to that solution at the very end of the lesson. But as we continue to think about these crowds, who else do we, like just another example that we think about is right back to back in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, if you will turn there. Go to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. Jesus is telling about the different type of people that are in this kingdom that he's bringing. It says the merciful, those who are pure in heart, the peacemakers. And he's talking about how they're blessed if they're these people. And then look at verse 10 of Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10. It said, blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And he says, blessed are you when people, the crowds at large, when everyone insults you and they persecute you and they falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. It says, rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So right in these two verses, the crowds, they're going to persecute you. Like they're going to not like you. But then look down into verse 14. To the same group, Jesus says, you're the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. It says, therefore, let your light shine before men, for all people, in such a way that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. Y'all see that there? It's like back-to-back reactions with the crowds. One second he's warning, they're going to persecute you. And the next it's like, hey, when you do good deeds, they're going to glorify God. Like do your good deeds so the crowds and the people, they glorify your Father who's in heaven. I'm hoping I'm building this like kind of conflict there between these voices. They can sound two different ways. And so they can speak truth, they can speak goodness, or they can persecute and they can destroy us, these crowds. And think about what it means to be controlled by the crowds, because that was the problem the Pharisees had. They listened to the crowds too much. All they were concerned about is what people were saying about them. They wanted to put on good appearances. They were controlled by what the crowds thought about them. They wanted to give a good projection to those people. And then I couldn't help but think of this as well, as we're listening, we're trying to be wise in what voices we listen to. A negative example of just the voices at large that are projected to us is on social media and news outlets. Like, I'm hard-pressed to find a good example of positive feedback coming from those two realms. Because the thing is all of those are, you're the product in both of those scenarios. If you're watching the news, it's going to be what's going to keep your attention. What's going to keep you focused so that you see the ads and whatnot. Same thing with social media. What's going to draw you in? What's going to keep your attention? And in both of those cases, it's just trying to suck the life out of you and then draw you in by things that trigger you, like fear, like desire. And neither of those are things that should control us. And that's what those sources in the world, that's what they do, is they try to draw us in and distract us. And so I've just kind of spitballed a few examples there of how the voice of the crowd can either influence us positive or negatively, and how it could control us positive or negatively. It depends on the scenario. So now let's move on to family and friends. This next one, the second voice that can influence us in our lives is family and friends. And for this one, I want to look at another example in the Bible. If you will, turn to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16. Matthew 16, Jesus has been going with his disciples for a while and going about teaching and healing people. And so he asked them this question. He says, "Who do men say that I am?" To see, like, do they realize who he is, what he's doing? And if you will, look down in Matthew chapter 16, start in verse 15. And then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And then Simon Peter, he answered, and he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah." He says, "Because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you." He says, "But my Father who is in heaven." So Jesus, when he hears Peter say this, he's like, "You're speaking the words of God to me. Like no one down here, no human, nothing flesh and blood has revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." And so Jesus here is hearing words of truth of who he is from one of his friends, Peter. But what's the very next thing that happens? Keep reading down in verse 21. Matthew chapter 16, look at verse 21. Same disciple, very same disciple. It says, verse 21, "From that time Jesus began to show to them how he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and to be killed and then raised up on the third day." And it says Peter, he took him aside and he began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord, that this should ever happen to you." And then he turned and he said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." I mean, this is like back to back. Like Jesus' friend, one of his closest friends, Peter, he said, "You're the Christ." And he's like, "You're speaking God's words right now. Like, I'm hearing God's words out of your mouth." The very next second, "You're speaking Satan's words to me right now. Like, you're the voice of the tempter right now. Like, that's what you're doing." And it's like, which is it? Like, we can experience that same thing. People can speak words of truth, or people can speak truth was on this side. Yeah, this was the words of truth. And then people can speak the exact opposite. Like, which is it? How do we know the difference? And now as well, friends, and then also family, if you will. Turn to Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6. This specifically has to do with parents. But in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1 through 4, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long in the land." And then verse 4, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." It's specific. It specifies fathers there because as fathers, as men of the house, like you have a specifically, like one of your roles is to lead your household. And this is very challenging because as a leader, like whether you're a father or a mother, like both are involved here, but specifically this is addressed to fathers in a very serious way. Because parents are the first representative of God to their children. Because God is our great Father, the first representative is going to be a child's father. Like when they hear God as a father, what's going to come to mind? Like what are they going to think? Are they going to have to do some like unlearning of what a father is? Do they think like absent? Do they think quick to anger? Do they think like ignoring me? Like what do they think when they hear that? When they think about their parents, when they think about their father? Or do they think like loving, compassionate, patient, slow to anger, like abundant in steadfast love? Like these things that God is. Like that's what we're supposed to I'm not a parent. I don't know why I said that's what I'm not. But whenever a parent is parenting their child, like you are representing God to them. And are you speaking truth? Or are you speaking not truth to them? Are you representing God as he is? Or are you misrepresenting God as he is? And so family and friends, these different outside voices that can influence us. And we have to discern on what voices do we listen to. And so now this last one, we've looked at the voice of the crowd, we've looked at the voice of family and friends, and then thirdly and lastly, the last voice that we'll talk about is our own voice, ourselves. Because this can go two ways. The first way is that our own voice, our own like self-awareness can be too highly. And the person to think about with that in the Bible is Nebuchadnezzar, right? Because what happens to Nebuchadnezzar whenever he looks around at Babylon? He's looking around one day. And he says, look at this great Babylon, he says, that I have built. And then it's like immediately, God says, you know what? For a time, 7 times will pass over you. And you will be like a beast of the field. Like he was king of the world. Babylon was the mightiest nation at the time. And now your hair is going to become like a bird. You're going to crawl on the ground. Remember in creation what the hierarchy is of creation? God, humanity, animals, and then like non-animate things. It's like you were up here. You thought you were up here. Now I'm lowering you down to like the animal level. Like that's what you're acting like whenever you think too highly of yourselves. And so we can do that with our own voices. We can tell ourselves, we can think we are something even when we're nothing, as Paul says in Galatians chapter 6. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 3, he says, if anyone thinks he's something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Like we can be self-deceiving of what we actually are. But then it can also go too far the other way. Think too highly of ourselves, and we can think too lowly of ourselves. Because think about Elijah. After he had this climactic moment in his life, he was defeated the 400 prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, and then suddenly the very next day, the evil queen Jezebel, she says, I'm going to make you just like those prophets, and may the gods do more to me if I don't make you dead like one of them by this time tomorrow. So Elijah runs away. He runs all the way out to Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, like way far away. He travels 40 days away. And then he goes to Mount Sinai and he sits there, and God comes to him and he speaks with him. And he says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah's like, there's no one left. Like, it's just me, and I can't do it. Like, he's like, there's nothing left to do. Like, there's no one else that serves you, and it's only me. And, like, Elijah, in a sense here, is depressed from what we can tell. Like, he was all alone. He seemed to think that he was nothing left. There was no one to serve him. And even his greatest efforts of defeating the 400 prophets of Baal, it turned out to be nothing. Like, immediately he was on the run again. So Elijah, he thought like too less of himself. And God, like, he takes his time with them and he says, hey, I still have 7,000 people in Israel who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. And he's like, also, I need you to do this and to this. And he gives them something to do, and he gives them words of encouragement. But Elijah, he didn't think too highly of himself. Do you see the problem here? Because what did Nebuchadnezzar say? He said, look at this great Babylon that I have built. Then what did Elijah say? He says, I've tried doing all this, and no one has responded to it, and there's no one left but me. Who's the center in both of those scenarios? Like, who's the focus on? themselves. Like humility is not just like running yourself into the ground. Like humility is about an honest view of yourself. That's what humility is. I think that was one of the questions on the worksheet. Humility is an accurate view of yourself. Because both if I think myself as the highest one in the whole world, or if all my attention is on myself and I'm like, woe is me, I'm the worst ever, I'm just nothing, like neither of those are true in God's eyes. Because in God's eyes, like we're sinful and we need him, but he also lifts us up and he puts us right next to him and he makes us rule with him in the heavenly places, as it says in Ephesians 2. He resurrects us and gives us new life. But then we're completely trusting and relying on him. Like it's only in Jesus that we can hold both of these at the same time. And that's why, well, there's a narrow way, because I can think too highly, and I can think too lowly of myself. Humility is that narrow way, right? Where I realize what I am, truly. I know who I am actually. And I realize my place before God as both greatly loved and greatly redeemed. Like that's that narrow way of humility. And so in those three voices, the voice of the crowd, the voice of family and friends, our own voices that we talk to ourselves, how do we discern like what's good and what's bad in all of these? And I hope that you've been realizing what I've been leaving out this whole time, which is the voice we need to listen to above all else that surrounds all of these, that helps us discern all of these different voices that are being thrown at us in our lives, is God's voice. Like that's who we need to listen to define and determine all of these other ones. Because Satan has one trick. Like he only has one trick up his sleeve. If you'll go ahead and be turning to Matthew chapter 4. Go to Matthew chapter 4. Satan has one trick up his sleeve, and that is lies. That's his only thing he can do. So he can twist and corrupt things. He cannot create. He's not powerful. He's not all powerful. What he does is he twists things. Like even in the garden, the very first lie that was ever told. In the Hebrew, it's just two words that are swapped around. It's the same words, it's just he like switches two of them. I think it's like two letters or something like that. It's just the same words, just swapped around just a little bit. And then even here, as we'll see in Matthew 4, Satan uses the words of God to distract and trying to tempt Jesus and destroy him. And so look at down in Matthew chapter 4, verse 5. This is the second temptation of Jesus and the devil in the wilderness. And it says, then the devil took him up into the holy city, and he had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple, and he said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. And then Jesus said to him, again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. So this is, I think this the story of Jesus' temptation in Matthew is one of my favorites, because it's very much like, I don't know, I just see it as, it's just how my brain works. It's like a sword duel. It's like the devil like stabs with this, and Jesus parries with this, and then the devil says, well, I raise you these verses, and then Jesus is like, well, this one. And it's just like this duel going on between the two of them. And every single time, Jesus answers with Scripture, and he answers with true words of God. Because what Satan does is he twists them. What the devil does is he twists God's words. And notice, kind of like we talked about this morning, the devil, he doesn't give the context to the verses that he quotes at Jesus. And so whenever he doesn't do that, it's kind of easy to make God's word say whatever you want it to say. But what Jesus does is he answers him with truth. And so that is how we discern these different voices, is we listen to truth. We spend time with the truth. Because the truth isn't just the words here, it's also a person. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And God is a person. He's not a set of like logical proofs. He's a being, like someone you would talk to around us. And so in that case, it's not just truth that we counter lies with, but it's also community and fellowship that we counter these false voices in our lives and how we hear the true ones. Because if you will, turn to John chapter 4. John chapter 4. We'll be wrapping it up here in John 4. Because Jesus, when he's speaking to the woman at the well, he makes this statement. He says this is John chapter 4, verse 23. John chapter 4, verse 23. It says, "But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers," he says, "will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers." So these two things, spirit and truth. We just talked about how when Satan lies, we counter that with truth. And then what's the other thing that we see happened in the very beginning? Did you notice how, I guess we didn't go there, but I feel like I've referenced Genesis 1 through 3 enough that hopefully it's landed a little bit in your minds. In Genesis 3, do we hear about Adam anywhere around Eve whenever the serpent's talking to her? Like, he's nowhere to be found. Yeah? What's going on there? Like, is there a wisdom that we can discern underneath that? Because it's only suddenly after she eats of the fruit that it's like, oh, and she gave some to her husband who was with her. It's like he was absent. It's like we didn't hear about him until after the sin had been committed. Is that the thing that we see happens is Eve is isolated. Like, she doesn't have her companion, her protector, who is supposed to defend her, with her. She doesn't have her husband. And so what the serpent does is he isolates her from her companion, and then he lies to her. Like, those two things. And so as all these voices are coming in, we counter them with truth, and then the serpent, he's going to try to isolate us. It makes us an easier target. Like, whenever you have a herd, if you watch, I grew up on the planet Earth. We love to watch that. And whenever there would be like a herd of bison, the animals that spooked them, the wolves that were chasing them, they would wait until one of the animals was either injured or sick, old or young, would stray off from the herd, and then that's the one they would go after. Like, that's how communities work, is you protect when you're whole and together. When someone's isolated, that's when they're vulnerable. And so what Satan does is he isolates people, and then he feeds them lies. It's like whenever you're just alone in your thoughts, and you're not talking in fellowship with people, it's like, well, maybe I'm the only one who's ever thought of this. Like, what? Well, why does God allow bad things to happen? It's like, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm like the only one who's ever thought of this question. It's like, no, you're surrounded by people who are striving to be with God. That's what this is. That's what the church is. It's a group of people seeking to follow God and become more like him, to become more like Jesus. And whenever we think that we're all alone in our walk with God, that's when Satan's going to do his work. Like, he's going to try and lie to us, distract us, and use those negative voices of crowds, of family, of friends, even ourselves, to make us fall away and to leave God and to sin. And so these two things I think we see in John 4. We counter lies and we counter isolation with truth and with spirit. Because think about how Paul describes the church in Ephesians chapter 2. He says we all have access in one spirit to the Father. Because what is spirit? I don't mean necessarily God's spirit, but just the idea of spirit in general. Think about in the Bible, if you take a breath and you breathe out your breath. In the Bible, the word for spirit, the word for breath, and the word for wind are all the same word. So whenever those three things, what do they all have in common? Spirit, breath, and wind. They're invisible forces that animate things, that make things move. Like when I look outside and I can literally see it right now. A breeze a wind blowing a branch out there. I can't see the wind, but I can see its effects. And then when I take a breath and I breathe, I can't see the air I'm breathing, but I mean, I'm not passed out on the ground. I'm walking around, so you can all see me animated. In a similar way, when it says that God is spirit, can we see God? No. Can we see how he affects those around us, how he affects our own lives? Do we have the eyes to see that? Because that's how he works. And whenever we're in a community like this, of people that have access in one spirit to the Father, we're unified in that. We're one church, one spirit. We all have one common hope. We have one common love, one common faith. And then in that community, we hear the truth spoken to us by other people who are listening to God's truth, listening to God's word, spending time seeking him. And so those are the two things that we use to counter those false voices, those lies, those things that we shouldn't be listening to. Because It's so important. I've seen some of my best friends. Like I have one right now in mind, just to be real and personal with it. Like I remember in high school, like he would say things like he would want to sit by himself. He'd try to go isolate himself in the lunchroom. And then when I would go and talk to him, he's like, I'm not worth anything. Like I'm not worth y'all spending time with. And like, that's a lie. Like that's not true. Thankfully, he's like come out of that. But for a while, like he's talked to me about it before, but he was in very dark places in that time. And it's because he was alone and he isolated, and then he believed lies that he told himself. Because the thing is like we started with, is that voices you listen to is what you live into. And make sure to listen to the right voices. Because in God's eyes, God says, you're dearly loved, you're worth redeeming, you're my child, you're my son, you're my daughter, you're worth losing my own life for and dying on the cross. Like that's true things. That's the truth. And I'm sure that if you're feeling those things, you talk to people around you, those in this community of love and of service to God would say those same things to you as well. And in that way, we have one spirit that we're all fellowshipping together and with God and participating in his love. And so in conclusion, as we wrap this up, the two things that we need to watch out for is whenever Satan tries to lie to us and when he tries to isolate us. And the things we use to counter that is truth and spirit or community. And so as we go forth, it's just as we keep in mind, let's try to pay attention to what voices are we listening to? What voices are we shema-ing to? Are we living and acting into? And then let us talk with those around us, those we love. Let us talk to God. Let us read his words that he's given us so that we hear the truth and we live into the truth. And then in that way, we become more like him and we spread his life and his love to those that surround us. But of course, to participate in that great community of love and to be joined to the one who is the way, the truth, and the life, we must be baptized into him. And so if there's anyone here tonight who hasn't become a Christian, we invite you to do that now. Become a disciple of Jesus. There is no other way to life. He is the way to life. And if there's anyone who you became isolated, you started believing lies, and Satan tempted you away from the fold, we invite you back tonight, and we'll pray for you. We'll speak truth to you. As the voice of love, and we'll speak God's words of truth to you and welcome you back into his fold.